Welcome to The Explainer. I am so incredibly excited you're here with us today. Look, we aren't going to be focusing on the daily news cycle or partisan talking points. Instead, we're taking a massive step back to dissect the very anatomy of our modern political systems. We're going to explore the fascinating, and honestly, sometimes kind of unsettling, academic models that explain democratic erosion.
So, is our democracy in danger? It's a pretty heavy question, right? And it's actually one that political scientists Stephen Levitsky and Daniel Ziblatt note they never thought they'd be seriously asking about the United States. For decades, the general assumption was that wealthy, educated democracies with robust middle classes had somehow managed to, defy political gravity. But to understand the current global anxiety surrounding democratic institutions, we've got to look at how these systems actually unravel.
I want you to consider this chilling quote from a voter in Barinas, Venezuela on election night back in 1998. Democracy is infected, and Chavez is the only antibiotic we have. Wow, it's an incredibly powerful sentiment, and it perfectly captures how the subversion of democracy doesn't usually begin with some comic book villain twirling a mustache. It starts with genuine popular support. It starts with everyday voters actively seeking a cure for a system they feel is deeply, deeply broken. To really understand how democratic systems fail globally, we have to look at these shifts through the lens of political science theory.
Okay, let's dive into our roadmap for today. We'll be covering 1. The mythical rational voter, 2. Manufacturing public consent, 3. Populism and institutional erosion, 4. How democracies slowly die, and finally, 5. The post-democracy era.
Let's jump right into Section 1, the mythical rational voter.
So, for a democracy to function, we generally just assume voters are these perfectly rational actors, right? People who carefully weigh the evidence and make choices based on objective reality. Well, political psychology paints a much, much messier picture. Economist Bryan Caplan and philosopher Jason Brennan argue that irrationality isn't just a random glitch in the voting public. Actually, scratch that. It's a foundational feature. The whole model of the perfectly rational, hyper-informed citizen is, according to these scholars, basically a total myth.
Now, what's really fascinating is Brennan's vivid typology of voters from his book Against Democracy. He breaks us down into 3 categories. First up, the hobbits. These are citizens who are pretty apathetic and totally happy to just ignore politics altogether. Next, we have the hooligans. They consume political information like rabid sports fans. They're just hunting for anything that supports their team and fiercely rejecting the rest. Finally, you have the highly scientific, objective Vulcans. The catch? Brennan argues true Vulcans practically don't exist in the wild. At the end of the day, most of us are just playing the role of hobbits or hooligans.
Building on that idea, Bryan Caplan points out that voters actively prefer policies that directly contradict expert economic consensus. He zeroes in on 4 deeply ingrained biases: an anti-market bias, an anti-foreign bias, a make-work bias, and a pessimistic bias. And here's the kicker. Because an individual's vote has virtually zero mathematical impact on a giant election's outcome, Caplan argues that voters pay absolutely no personal price for holding on to false, emotionally comforting beliefs. So we vote our biases, which naturally can lead to disastrous national outcomes. Why does this matter to us? Because those emotionally comforting but mathematically flawed choices shape the actual literal economy you and I live in every single day.
This brings us to a highly controversial theoretical alternative proposed by Brennan known as epistocracy. Think of it as a system where the right to vote is restricted only to citizens who can actually pass a test demonstrating political competence. Now, as an objective explainer, it's absolutely not our job to advocate for this kind of system, but it poses a profound theoretical question. If democratic outcomes are consistently flawed because of our inherent voter psychology, does fixing the system require fundamentally limiting who gets to participate? It's a lot to chew on.
Moving on to Section 2, manufacturing public consent.
Okay, so if we as voters have this flawed psychology, where are we even getting our information? In their absolutely seminal 1988 book Manufacturing Consent, Edward Herman and Noam Chomsky introduced this fascinating propaganda model. They theorize that market forces and elite interests subtly filter out dissent through 5 distinct mechanisms. Step 1, media is controlled by massive, profit-driven corporations. Step 2, they rely on advertising revenue, giving advertisers de facto licensing authority. Step 3, heavy dependence on government and corporate sources for the actual news. Step 4, they face flack, which is expensive, organized pushback from powerful groups. And Step 5, they rely on a unifying ideology like anti-communism or the war on terror to push opposing views to the absolute margins. So the big takeaway? Public consent isn't coerced by brute force. It is quietly manufactured by filtering exactly what you and I are allowed to see.
Which leads us perfectly into Section 3, Populism and Institutional Erosion.
All right, so let's put the pieces together. We have an electorate that's prone to bias, operating in a highly filtered media ecosystem. What happens when political leaders figure out how to leverage that exact combination? Well, researchers studying democratic backsliding have identified a very consistent playbook used by populist leaders worldwide. It almost always starts by framing existing democratic institutions, the courts, the press, electoral commissions, as elitist and totally disconnected from the true people. Once that narrative takes root, leaders move quickly to consolidate executive power. They slowly chip away at judicial independence, suppress media freedom, and brilliantly exploit national crises, like a pandemic for instance, to justify sidelining normal democratic checks and balances. Academically speaking, populism is a systemic challenge, where leaders claim a monopoly on representing the people in order to dismantle the very systems meant to protect them.
And it is incredibly vital to note that this is definitely not a localized issue. Academic literature extensively documents these exact same patterns of democratic backsliding across vastly different cultures and regions. We're talking Hungary, Turkey, Brazil, the United States, Israel. It is a highly replicable, truly global model of governance.
Let's dig deeper in Section 4, How Democracies Slowly Die.
This brings us to a really sobering analysis by political scientists Levitsky and Ziblatt. The crucial point they make is this sharp contrast between the past and the present. During the Cold War, democracies mostly died at the hands of men with guns. Think of Chile in 1973, jets bombing the presidential palace, a fast, violent, undeniable collapse. But today, the method has completely changed. Modern democracies die at the hands of elected leaders who use legal subversion. It's a slow, almost imperceptible erosion from the inside out. There are no tanks in the street. The constitutions, they stay perfectly in place.
To put that into perspective, just look at the timeline of Venezuela. Hugo Chavez was elected perfectly democratically back in 1998. By 1999, his coalition wrote a brand new constitution, again done democratically. It wasn't until years later, in 2004, that the Supreme Court was packed, and it took nearly 2 full decades, until 2017, for a single-party assembly to fully usurp the power of Congress, officially cementing an autocracy. The electoral road to authoritarianism is so incredibly deceptive because every single step can be framed as a totally normal legal reform.
Finally, let's wrap up with Section 5, the post-democracy era.
Let's pull all the way back now to our macro-level perspective. If institutions are eroding and voters are essentially being bypassed by elites, what kind of system are we actually living in right now? Political scientist Colin Crouch coined a term for this, post-democracy. He theorizes that we are moving toward a society that fully maintains the formal shell of democratic institutions. I mean, we still hold regular elections, we still have freedom of speech, but the actual energy and real decision-making power have quietly shifted away from the democratic arena. Instead, true power rests firmly within small circles of a politico-economic elite. It's like a Hollywood set. The facade is there, but there's nothing behind it.
So what's driving this? Crouch identifies a few major structural causes. First, globalization makes it incredibly difficult for nations to just control their own domestic economic policies. Second, there's a massive entanglement between the public and private sectors, characterized by this revolving door of politicians and corporate managers. On top of that, the privatization of public services entirely removes them from your democratic oversight. And finally, the working class has largely lost the common goals that once powerfully united them. Crouch argues that reversing this trend isn't impossible, but it requires everyday citizens like us to aggressively reclaim our place in decision-making through intense civic education and powerful advocacy groups.
We have covered an absolute ton of ground today, from hobbits and hooligans to manufactured consent and the slow legal decay of our institutions. It leaves us with a really profound question to ponder as we go about our week. If democracy is fundamentally vulnerable to its own voters and its own elected leaders, how on earth do we protect the system from itself? I really hope this explainer has given you a powerful new framework for looking at the world. Keep questioning, keep learning, and I'll see you in the next explainer.